Hey, this is Dan. Welcome to the first episode of our Hidden Gems series. This is where we're going to be talking about some classic albums that maybe flew under the radar that we feel deserve more attention. And yeah, I'm going to start with a classic from the American band RIOT. And here we have let's see, this was the fourth album, Restless Breed. And this came out in 1982, and it was the first album that they did after losing their original singer, Guy Speranza. So the reason I consider this kind of an underrated album is, like, if you ask anybody their favorite RIOT albums, it's always Fire Down Under. I mean, that's like the one album that like everybody mentions. And it's a great album. I mean, I totally agree. That is their best album. It's just, start to finish, classic. But this album to me is like second best. It's very much in a similar vein. It's just different vocals. This is when they got Red Forrester, and his vocal style is completely different. He has a much more like bluesy David Coverdale kind of vibe on some of the slower stuff, but then he's got like this really intense, like venomous bite to his voice when he sings the more rocking songs. So yeah, it's hard to like even pick out a bad song on here. Like you've got Hard Lovin' Man, which is just classic opener. It's got that just great opening riff that I remember distinctly when Iron Maiden came out with Power Slave and 2 Minutes to Midnight. First time I heard that, I was like, oh my God, that's the same riff as Hard Lovin' Man. And it's like, I can't believe they stole that riff. And then, of course, I listened to it later, and it's like, they're not even close to the same riff. But it's also, I think, the first album where they did a ballad, Showdown, which I remember at the time thinking was just, kind of like, why are they doing this? It's just kind of commercial. And but that's a song that even now, like, I listen to, and it's like, this is great. It's very atmospheric. His vocals on it are amazing. This is like the classic lineup. You got Sandy Slavin on drums. You got Kip Lemming on bass. The two guitarists, Rick Ventura and Mark Reale, are just like at their peak. And I think it's actually, even though it's maybe a little more diverse album than Fire Down Under was, I think in some ways it's almost heavier in places. You have songs like Violent Crimes and Lone Shark that are just really fast. They're almost kind of like a proto speed metal that they did later with Thundersteel. So anyways, that is my take on it. And I'm going to turn it over to Nels and see what his thoughts are.
Yeah, well, like you said, whenever I think of RIOT, I think of the one that everyone thinks of, the Fire Down Under. And I tend to forget about some of their other albums. For me, Thundersteel is like a major. I love that album.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree that album it's like one of those ones that everybody kind of, if you were into heavy metal back in those days, about RIOT. You've heard of RIOT. They weren't like one of the super top tier bands necessarily, but they're one that had enough exposure that everyone kind of knows who they are. But then some of their better albums just either didn't get, pushed in the same way, or didn't get the exposure that would have, that they deserved. And so there's some of these hidden gems like that it's also interesting. You mentioned that, when you first hear certain things, you remember thinking, oh, that riff's the same as blah, blah, blah. And then later, out of context, you're like, what was I thinking? There's so many instances of that for me that I'm like, just thinking, oh, I thought this at the time, and I was very sure of it. And nope, now that I look back, it's not at all like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I definitely like that album. RIOT is one of those bands that, I'll go on a kick where I just don't listen to them for quite some time, and all of a sudden I rediscover them and just like set all their albums that I have on repeat and just play through. So definitely a good hidden gem.
Yeah, and Thundersteel is that's the other one that I think a lot of people will mention when they if you ask them their favorite RIOT album, because I think that's like a slightly later generation of people. They're like, that was the album that came out when they were younger.
Right.
And it's just such a completely different style. Like, you know, it's
Yeah, you mentioned the whole proto speed metal thing. That was kind of, there was a long time when just about every album, well, back when albums used to have variety on them, just about every album would have like some slow songs, some medium songs, and then that song where you're like, oh, have you heard this? Because it's the fastest song I've ever heard, right? It's the one that sticks out. In retrospect, they're mid-tempo at best now, but
right.
whole proto speed metal, almost coming up towards thrash. There's a lot of really good stuff there, Accept and bands like that you kind of forget that wasn't a thing at that time when they started doing that. So yeah, there's a lot of really cool stuff, and it's hidden in with other content that you wouldn't call that at all. So
yeah, and I remember like when I first was getting into heavy metal, like it was right around this time. I think it was like about 81, 82. And some of the first albums I owned were On Through the Night and High and Dry by Def Leppard, and then
right.
Under and Restless Breed by Riot. And those were like my two favorite bands for, a couple years there, just be based on those four albums. So I always kind of associate those all together and it's, in my memory. So
I think for me, the first two albums that I ever bought with my own money were Highway to Hell, AC/DC, and Black Sabbath, Heaven and Hell. But then I think the third one was High and Dry. And I remember because it came on the radio, they got some airplay, and they had a thing that said, come on down, buy the cassette, and if you don't like it, you can bring it back for your money back. And I'm like, well, what do I have to lose? And of course, that's a classic album that, for a band that, well, let's not talk about Def Leppard, but yeah.
Classic albums later.
Yeah, in fact, when you were talking about overlooked albums, On Through the Night for me is just like, man, that's an album that even the band themselves seem to feel not that fond of it. But to me, it's like, it's a fantastic album, and it's completely different from almost all their stuff that followed.
Right.
And it's got a very, it's got a very, rock and roll, not as straightforward, more complex pieces to it, almost like a Rainbow or that kind of stuff. But yeah.
It definitely had some of that leftover 70s, like more.
Yeah, like AOR, like the hard rock of the 70s. It had some complexity to it. It didn't have just one guitar part. It would have two guitar parts, and there's little solos going through it, and things like that. It has some more 70s rock and roll feel.
Cool. All right. The other thing I just wanted to mention real quick was the album cover. This is one of those things that like a lot of people complain about, like all of Riot's album covers.
Right.
But I feel like this is actually one of their better ones. Like,
they were clearly trying to do that thing. There was a meme, if you will, where heavy metal bands would kind of have a mascot thing, a recurring, Eddie for Iron Maiden, etc. And I felt like Riot were always trying to do that with the seal head. What was that?
It was the Mighty Tior was the name it eventually gave to him.
There you go.
And why? I don't know. Because, you look at Rock City, the first album, and it's just like, what the fuck? It's like just a weird concept, but then on top of that, it's like not even executed very well. Like, it's just, what are you guys doing?
Yeah, you have to wonder back in those days what kind of budget, what kind of availability of people that knew what they were doing, basically.
Yeah. And I'm sure a lot of the albums the band had like no clue what was even going to be or had any.
There's that for sure. I'm sure there's a lot of that.
All right, so let's move on to your choice for this month's Hidden Gems.
All right, so whenever I think of an overlooked metal album, one of the first things that pops into my head is Headhunter by Crocus, which I think it definitely falls into that category. And I think Crocus in general kind of, for me, they epitomize the missed opportunity that some bands had to really make. They made a lot of great music. And in fact, right before Headhunter, I think this was probably their biggest album at the time, One Vice at a Time. This is a good album. But again, this is one of those albums where back at the time when I listened to it, I remember thinking, well, all they're doing is taking AC/DC style. They basically have a vocalist that sounds halfway between Bon Scott and halfway between Brian Johnson. I remember thinking, I like this album, but it isn't super original. I didn't feel like they were like doing anything cutting edge on it. And then right after, I mean, the very next album, Headhunter, it felt like they somehow, some way, they came up with a style that was more unique. It doesn't sound like AC/DC at all to me. In some ways, it's much heavier. It's got a little bit of that proto speed metal stuff in there a bit, but it also has a lot more, again, that sort of 70s hard rock type of a feel where the arrangements are more complicated. There's more things going on. It's not as basic as straightforward. And the vocals are really amazing on it. But then right after that album, of course, as soon as you say Crocus to people who were kind of casual fans during that time, they remember the Blitz or whatever the album that came out after it, and their cover of Ballroom Blitz, which got heavy airplay on MTV Headbangers Ball. And in my opinion, it was just an example of the band, again, changing their style to chase maybe more success, more accessibility to a wider range of fans. And it really, to me, it was wimpy, and it was toned down, and it was super commercial and not super quality. So that to me makes Headhunter even more of a standout, where they totally fell, in my opinion, from grace after that album, and in a way that I think probably made it so that there aren't a lot of people out there going, hey, I'll check out Crocus's back catalog, And maybe if they do, then fans of more bubblegum sort of glam rocky stuff that they did later might not even like the Headhunter, because it is a lot more complicated. It's a pretty heavy album, and so, just for that reason, it's a hidden gem of an album, but it's also just kind of a sad. If they had kept making music like Headhunter, in my mind, and of course it's the band, hey, they did what they wanted to do on whatever level, and that's totally fine. It's just, man, I think of, hey, if they had done more albums like Headhunter, wow, what their back catalog would be amazing. So that to me is, I wish I had a copy of the album to show. Apparently, I didn't buy it back in the days when I was buying LPs, and I have it on CD. And my CDs are packed away still in boxes. So, but anyway, that album is just, to me, that's the one that I think of, along with things like we said, Def Leppard, On Through the Night, and things like that, where a band seemed to have a thing going that I really liked, and then for whatever reason, market pressures, whatever, ended up changing. And also, Headhunter has some great, or at least one great video too from that album.
Oh my God, Screaming in the Night.
Screaming in the Night is the most incredibly terrible video you'll ever see. Low budget, weird, sort of, they're trying some avant-garde artsy thing back in the dark ages of music videos.
Yeah, it's like, oh, let's watch the band perform. No. Let's make up.
No, that's boring. Anyone can go see that.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, Headhunter has a guest appearance by Rob Halford singing backup vocals. I wish I had the album in front of me so I could know the names of the songs. Ready to Burn, I think, is the title of that track. Yeah, Ready to Burn. Great song.
Great song.
Again, there's well, like sort of the hard rock of the 70s and a lot of the earlier metal, there's a lot of variety on that album. It has ups and downs and slow parts and fast parts, but it's got some really, again, not compared to thrash or modern speed at all, but back in the day, it's some very hard-edged and like up-tempo, fast songs. It's heavy, It's the stuff that I like about heavy metal.
Yeah, the Scorpions, I think, were another one that did that too, where there would be songs on there like, Dynamite or Now, or,
Yeah, for sure.
tempo for the time, if you think about it.
Right. And another band that had a lot of that 70s influence, I think, on their song structure and the way they wrote songs, especially, when Uli was in the band. But yeah, definitely, man, a lot of people, again, I think the Scorpions might be another example of your average person. When you say the Scorpions, they say rock you like a hurricane, and they think of it as this sort of stereotypical 80s kind of, I don't know, cliche song, even though I think it's a great song.
Yeah, it is.
But the Scorpions have like so much more. Their back catalog is just filled with classics, and it's kind of a shame that I think a lot of people just think of them as that one song if they don't, follow metal and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
So my experience with Headhunter, I know my brother had it back in the day, but I don't really remember it as well as I do like One Vice at a Time. And
right. What was right before One Vice at a Time? I always forget.
I think it was Hardware.
Yes, Hardware, right.
And that was actually a really good album too.
It is a good album, yeah. I know that Ted, I'm sure I heard Headhunter first from Ted. I'm sure I heard One Vice at a Time first from Ted as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. Something I was going to mention that I forgot about Riot was I'm absolutely sure that Ted, he owned Fire Down Under at least, and probably Restless Breed too before, that's where I heard them from. So
right.
He was a great introducer of music.
Well, back in the day, you didn't have the internet to go, oh, I just heard of the 27 albums that came out on obscure labels yesterday, right? And it's back in the day, it was kind of, you'd go to a record store, you'd look at a record maybe if you found it, and you'd go, based on this cover, am I going to like this? I don't know. And you might get an underground magazine like Kerrang or something like that would review it. And even still, it was a big gamble a lot of times because these things weren't getting necessarily radio airplay until a little bit later, I guess, when certainly here in Eugene, there started being a little bit of heavy metal on the radio.
Yeah. And obviously, we were like, teenagers at the time, so we didn't have a lot of money to spend. So we were selling out $7 or $8 for an album.
Right.
And you really didn't. Sometimes you just didn't know what it sounded like at all. You were just really taking it single.
I've got a bunch of albums that that went both ways. Where I remember buying them, and I'm like, oh, this turned out to be great, and I had no idea. And then I have a bunch of them that I'm like, man, that was a waste of my, at the time, lot of money, $8 or whatever. But yeah, when you're a kid, it's like those decisions are important. They have a lot of bearing. I can buy this one album this month or whatever.
Yeah. The other thing though, I think looking back, that actually was good about that was it kind of limited like what you had to listen to, because you couldn't listen to the radio really. There was no streaming or anything. Like you had the albums that you had, and so you would listen to them a lot.
Oh my God, yeah.
So I think you had like a greater appreciation. Like there's be songs like on the first few listens that you're like, oh, I just want to skip that, or that's not very good. But then after a while, you're like, oh, that actually has some cool qualities to it.
For sure, a lot of, especially I think more complex music. A lot of times, if it doesn't hit you as quite what you were expecting the first time through, you might have a negative or kind of blasé opinion of it. And then again, if you listen to it several times, some of those grow on you and they become like your favorite things. Now I remember when Heaven and Hell was like one of the few albums that I had on cassette. Man, I remember listening to that so much on headphones. Now, whenever I listen to any remix of Heaven and Hell or any, alternate version, I'm just like super picky about it because I had listened to that tape so often. Some of the remixes that have come out that are really good, to me they just sound weird because it's like, no, that's not the song that I heard 10,000 times, and that bass part right here is just a little bit louder than it used to be, and if I with that constant repetition, I think really it makes you super familiar with the music.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, with Headhunter, I actually, it wasn't, I think, until the 90s when I bought it on CD at some point, that I really was like, I mean, I'd heard some of the songs for sure back in the day, but
Yeah.
like as an album, like I never really appreciated it until then. It was just like, holy cow. Like it's one
Yeah.
of those albums that's, yeah, start to finish. Like I don't think there's a bad song on there.
Oh yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah, same here. I know I didn't buy it back in the day when I was buying records because it's not in the box. So but I eventually bought it later in CD times, and yeah, it's just you listen to the, you know, sometimes I'll go to listen to one or two songs off that album, and you end up listening to all of them because it's just like the whole thing is good. His voice is great. The mix is really good. There's a lot of space in that mix. I can't remember who produced that. It was
Tom Allen.
Okay. Yeah, I knew it was
Rob Halford. And
yeah, that's what I got right. Rob Halford. Yeah, just a great album that, yeah, definitely when it came out, it was not on my radar. And again, to me at the time, I liked Crocus. I had liked their previous albums, but I thought of them as kind of not super original. But yeah, Headhunter really broke that mold for me, in my opinion.
So that concludes the first edition of Hidden Gems. We're curious what the viewers think about these albums. So if you have any particular thoughts on Restless Breed or Headhunter, please leave some comments below and we can start a discussion about it. Also, if you get a chance, please like this video and subscribe to The Plague. And we shall see you hopefully next month with some more Hidden Gems. Take care.